Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River. I hereby give notice on a future day that I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas over 5,000 babies are born each year at Nova Scotia's esteemed IWK Children's Hospital in Halifax, and whereas key members of the care team for mothers and infants are qualified and compassionate nurses, and whereas these nurses help support new mothers with post-delivery medical care, breastfeeding instructions, and care for infants with special needs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge the valuable services that nurses provide, including the nurses who take care of our youngest and most vulnerable Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. We'll now move on to oral questions by members put to ministers. The time is now 12:21. We'll conclude at 1:21. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure most, if not all, members of this House know that the importance of our nurses can't be overstated. Neither can their knowledge of their frontline knowledge of our healthcare system be overstated. Nurses in Capital Health are insisting that staffing levels in our hospitals are inadequate. Mr. Speaker, we're here tonight because they feel that no one has listened to their concerns, whether it be the management of our hospitals or the health authorities themselves or even their own government. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier if he can inform the House what steps he himself has taken to ensure that our hospitals are, in fact, adequately staffed.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as you would know, since taking power on October 22nd, the health ministers have been travelling this province as we made a commitment that we would be reducing the health authorities from 9 to 1. And as part of that consultation is also looking at staffing levels, Mr. Speaker, at every hospital in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is, of course, the government's duty to ensure that our hospitals are adequately staffed, and listening to nurses, those that work on the front lines, is one way to assure themselves, as a government or not, that is the case. Sadly, something that we have not seen addressed up to this point, and it is not being addressed in the proceedings here of the House today or in the next few days. There appears to be no plan to actually examine whether nurses may well have a point about the staffing in our hospitals. So I will ask the Premier, without taking these steps now to assure the government that our hospitals are either adequately staffed or not, how can the Premier say that public health care is protected?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member of my answer to the first question. The Minister of Health is doing exactly that, Mr. Speaker, as he's traveling this province, talking to district health authorities about the fact that we will be merging them into one district health authority, Mr. Speaker, with regional zones, and part of that conversation is looking at staffing levels in all of our hospitals.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to say that clearly the government has decided it's sufficient to consult with the very health authority executives that have so frustrated nurses that they have resorted to the bargaining table and ultimately to appealing to the public for help in having their voices heard that there is a problem with staffing in our hospital wards. It's a flawed process, Mr. Speaker, and that is partly why here we are once again as a province at the brink of a crisis in our health care system. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier, in light of all that's gone on, the fact that important procedures are already being cancelled, the fact that we're on the verge of a strike, possibly as early as tomorrow morning, can he tell the House and all Nova Scotians that they can be assured that they will have the health care services that they need starting tomorrow morning?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, as the Honourable Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would know, the employer in this case is Capital Health. They are doing what they've been asked to do, which is provide services to the people of the province. They've taken into account that potentially there's labour disruption, Mr. Speaker, coming. I want to remind this House, Mr. Speaker, is the leader of the Conservative Party that wants to take away the right to strike from healthcare workers. We've struck a balance, we believe, in ensuring that they have the right to strike, Mr. Speaker, once we've put together a level of essential service.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, in the last 30 days, we've watched the Premier go from one bargaining table to another with threats against healthcare workers. Instead of respecting the collective bargaining process that has served our province well, the Premier has brought chaos to labour relations in the province. First, the Premier botched the negotiations with home care workers, and now he's determined to pick a fight not only with the 2,300 nurses in Capital District Health Authority, but with more than 30,000 health care and community service workers from Yarmouth to Sydney. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, what does he stand to gain from turning labour relations in our province into such a tailspin?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, what has happened today, Mr. Speaker, is over the last 7 months, we've had 3 labour disruptions or potential labour disruptions in the healthcare system. What this bill puts in place is a mechanism to ensure that there is essential service provided to the people of this province, and then a strike can take place, Mr. Speaker, unlike what happened here 7 months ago, when then the NDP party unilaterally took away the right to strike from paramedics. We have said, let's level in a level of essential service and then allow workers to have their right to strike.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's been less than 6 months in this Premier's mandate, and he's changing the face of labour relations in this province forever, Mr. Speaker. He has done this on his own accord with virtually no consultation with the groups his changes are going to impact. So my question to the Premier is, why does the Premier feel entitled to take such drastic measures with so little disregard for the views of Nova Scotians, especially those Nova Scotians that will be impacted by the loss of their rights forever?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation that was introduced today is striking a balance between ensuring that those Nova Scotians that need health care services can rest assured there's a level of essential service, Mr. Speaker, as well as ensuring that workers across this province who feel they need to strike, Mr. Speaker, have that right, Mr. Speaker. This bill is a balance between making sure that patients have the services they want and workers have the right to act on a strike.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, over 30,000 healthcare workers, nurses, paramedics, social workers, physiotherapists, technicians, pharmacists, orderlies. These are the healthcare workers in our province that are now the target of this Premier with this legislation. So my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is who should be afraid that you're coming for them next?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it was, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, that member and that party that took away the right to strike from paramedics across this province. Mr. Speaker, under our legislation, Mr. Speaker, they would negotiate a level of essential service with their employer, Mr. Speaker, and then they could strike.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing we can all accomplish here in the next little while is to ensure that patient care is there for those Nova Scotians that need it. Already, many surgeries and other important medical procedures are in the process of being cancelled. Mr. Speaker, every day that goes by, not only do Nova Scotians go without the health care that they deserve, but the new backlog will just add to the already too long wait times. Can the Premier tell the House and all Nova Scotians that their health care will be there? How can the Premier tell Nova Scotians that their health care will be there for them when they need it, when so many important medical tests are already being cancelled?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it is exactly why the Minister of Health has been traveling this province, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we move from an administrative model, Mr. Speaker, to one that's focused on patients. And I hope as we continue this debate, Mr. Speaker, that we can get the support of the members opposite so that this bill can move forward. Mr. Speaker, we can put in place essential service legislation and then workers can have the right to strike.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I wish I could say that Nova Scotians patients are comforted by the tour of the Minister of Health, but the reality is that 6 months in, nothing has changed in our healthcare system. But what is happening tonight is that real services are being cut, Mr. Speaker, and it is the government that is ultimately responsible for ensuring that our health care is there for all Nova Scotians when they need it. I will ask the Premier, in light of where we are at this point in time, what is the government doing to ensure that health care is available to Nova Scotians, including tomorrow morning?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as he would know, Capital Health and the union have been negotiating, Mr. Speaker, that they've got to the point, Mr. Speaker, where today there was a 48-hour strike notice served to the people of the province of Nova Scotia. Capital Health would put in place as the employer a contingency plan that would ensure providing services, Mr. Speaker. It's the very reason we're here debating this bill is to ensure that we can put in place a level of essential services that Nova Scotians would know what services would be there in case of a labour disruption, Mr. Speaker, and this bill will allow that to happen as well as allow healthcare workers across this province to exercise their right to strike.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I know we'll hear from nurses and other Nova Scotians themselves as part of the bill debate process about whether they feel that they still have the right to strike or not. The issue I'm pursuing tonight is the patients that need medical attention in our hospitals, attention that requires the services of our hardworking nurses. Mr. Speaker, it's important that our hospitals be adequately staffed. Here at Capital Health, in light of what's going on, plans are being made to bring in nurses from other health authorities as necessary in light of the strike that we see before us. I'd like to ask the Premier if he can tell the House what is the plan to ensure adequate health care is provided across Nova Scotia, not just at Capital Health.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite would know, Mr. Speaker, it is the Capital Health's responsibility to deliver health care to the citizens of the Capital Region. They are now labour negotiations, Mr. Speaker. Then they have put in place a contingency plan, as have other health authorities across the province, if required, that they need to make changes in terms of staffing.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be for the Minister of Health. Having a plan to move nurses from other hospitals due to understaffed conditions in the Capital Health District, patient safety should be the primary concern at this point. And I ask the Minister through you, Mr. Speaker, what assurances can the Minister give to the patients and staff at other hospitals working like the Hants Community Hospitals that may be affected?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. At this stage, Phase 3 contingency plan is now at work, and I think the member opposite will find that, in fact, his hospital will have the nurse complement and the teams in place to deliver services to the people of the Hants West area.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. The Minister is quoted as saying, I know that we may have to call on other healthcare districts now to try and backfill those services, unquote. This means that staff will be transferred to the Capital Region from other outlying areas. The Hants Community Hospital, the following services are provided, Mr. Speaker: acute medical care, general surgical care, physio, lab services, diagnostic imaging, social work, respiratory care, home care Nova Scotia, VON, Home Support Central, Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech Clinic, to name a few, Mr. Speaker. What services at the Hants Community Hospital will suffer the most due to these staff transfers?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to answer the member opposite, I don't have a list of the detailed services that may have some postponement elements in place in the coming days. I believe that's why before there is a strike in the healthcare sector, that we know the level of services that will be offered to Nova Scotians. I think if we're looking at the patient first and the safety of Nova Scotians, that should be top of mind, and that's why our government is moving in the direction that it is.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pardon me. The patients and staff across the province are feeling the effects of the staff shortages in the capital region. The seriousness of the staffing levels will be felt for months to come by all those who are affected. How will this understaffing affect wait times for procedures planned at Hants Community and other hospitals?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we know that sometimes when there is a labour disruption, as we currently have, there is some backlog that impacts the system. It obviously has a cascading effect, and there are procedures that will be delayed. But one of the great, insights and in many ways a great inspiration that I saw as I've toured this province is the commitment of our healthcare workers through the entire spectrum of healthcare providers, and all will become a part of solving the problems and dealing with the challenges that we will have in the coming weeks.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. On December 6, 2007, when the Premier sat on this side of the House, he said, and I quote, "Healthcare workers, like so many other sectors of this province and across the country, have fought long and hard for their rights and benefits they now have thanks to unionization. Unionized healthcare workers are the backbone of our healthcare system. Now, the Premier is effectively stripping those very workers of those very rights. My question to the Premier is this: why are the healthcare workers today less important than the ones you spoke of in 2007?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, it's the very reason why we brought in this bill, Mr. Speaker, is we respect healthcare workers across this province, Mr. Speaker. We could have adopted the bill put forward by the Conservative Party in this House, which actually would have stripped them of the right to strike, Mr. Speaker, or we could have followed the lead of the previous government, which stripped the right to strike away from paramedics in this province, Mr. Speaker. We struck a balance, Mr. Speaker, we struck a balance. We're making sure that essential services are in place for Nova Scotians, and they'll know what those services are as we lead into any future labour disruptions, Mr. Speaker, and we are also protecting the right to strike for healthcare workers.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on our first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on December the 6th, 2007, the Premier on this side of the House also said the following, and I quote, "The issue around labour issues in the province of Nova Scotia in health care is not the cause of the problems that Nova Scotia are telling us of. They're talking about the shortage of doctors, talking about the shortage of nurses. They're talking about wait times. Picking a fight with our healthcare workers is not ensuring that Nova Scotians have access to the quality health care that they expect each and every one of us here to protect and deliver for them." So my question, Mr. Speaker, is this: will the Premier explain how his campaign against unionized healthcare workers will result in improvements in our healthcare system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was that party and that government, Mr. Speaker, that took an attack on unionized healthcare workers across this province when they stripped paramedics of the right to strike. Mr. Speaker, what this bill before us today, Mr. Speaker, is about ensuring that there are essential services in place for Nova Scotians when they need healthcare in case of a labour disruption, as well as protecting the right for healthcare workers to strike, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Somebody needs to teach the Premier, Mr. Speaker, the difference between essential services and emergency services in the healthcare system. When the paramedics in this province went on strike, they did not leave one paramedic to do any emergency care, unlike the nurses at Capitol who have offered to cover ER, to cover veterans care, to cover cancer care, to cover hemodialysis, to cover transplants. Mr. Speaker, there's a great difference between the essential services and the emergency services that nurses are prepared to provide and what was provided by the paramedics in the dispute that happened 7 months ago. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question to the Premier is this. The Premier stood in this House, on this side of the House, and said the following, and I quote, "Making a good faith collective bargaining process even more difficult by taking away healthcare workers' rights to strike is not going to make Nova Scotia a more attractive option when trying to recruit healthcare workers to this province." So my question to the Premier, when will he give up his attack on healthcare workers and concentrate on recruiting efforts for all healthcare professionals in our healthcare system?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only party in this House in the last 7 months that have attacked healthcare workers' rights to strike has been the New Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, in support of the Conservative Party. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is striking balance, ensuring that we have essential service in place that Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, will know what services are in place in case of a labour disruption, Mr. Speaker, as well as protecting the right of healthcare workers to strike, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Natural Resources. The issue of accessing affordable hardwood for the Groupe Savoie mill in Westville has been frustrating. The forestry industry is one of Nova Scotia's oldest industries and is in need of bold change in order to secure long-term sustainability of companies like the Groupe Savoie. My question today for the Minister is, since meeting with Groupe Savoie representatives in December, has the Minister been able to work with the company to find a way to allocate Crown lands to guarantee wood supply for their operation?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question, member. As I've stated in this House before, Mr. Speaker, there is currently a shortage of fibre in the province of Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has the second lowest amount of Crown land in the country after Prince Edward Island, and we have the second highest percentage of land that is currently protected, Mr. Speaker. And also because of the current moment in the cycle of the growth of our forest, we are faced with a fibre challenge right now. And Groupe Savoie is being impacted just like every other sawmill across the province when it comes to trying to access that fibre. We have been in constant conversations with Groupe Savoie. We met with one of the representatives actually on the weekend. And we will continue to work with them on this particular issue and hopefully find a resolution for the company.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess given the challenges of the fibre that's available, I would suggest that the government needs to look very carefully at how it allows companies access to Crown land. The forestry industry is struggling and looking to the government for solutions. So on December 4th, the Minister told the House of Assembly the following. One of the first orders of business for me when I came in as a Minister was to encourage the management development process to be expedited within the department. So I'm glad to hear that the Minister is looking at the processes And I'm hopeful that he is specifically looking at the processes around access to Crown land. Because I've been asking people what is the process, and I can't find anyone who can tell me the actual process for applying for access to Crown land, and that's a big concern of mine. So my question today for the Minister is, after a number of months working with the Department on processes, can the Minister tell me what the actual process is today to apply for access to Crown land?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. All the sawmillers across this province have direct access to the foresters, and our department have direct access to our staff in the various regions of this province. And it is through those staff people that an application happens. To date, we've been able to, on the Western Crown land, ensure that everyone that sent an application and did receive an allotment, and we are still working with other sawmillers in the province of Nova Scotia to work with private woodlot owners, because of the constraints we have with our public source, Mr. Speaker, to find solutions to this fibre challenge that we have.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
The problem is when I hear the Minister saying that everyone that's applied for access was granted access, and then nobody knows what the application process is, that's a bit of a concern for me. So I do believe that there are companies that would be desirous of access to Crown land that don't know how to turn, don't know what the process is, and maybe aren't getting a fair shake. And I'm pretty worried about that, because we can't expect our pulp industry, our lumber industry, our sawmills to operate effectively and to be competitive in an environment where the processes are unclear and possibly unfair. The Ivany report points to a 14% decline in exports from pulp mills over the last 10 years. And this is not acceptable. We have to do better. We have to establish processes that are fair and open and transparent to everyone. So my question today for the Minister is, when are we going to have a proper process in place for applications to obtain access to Crown land?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have met directly, personally, with almost the majority of the sawmillers across this province, and not one of those people have ever indicated to me that there is a problem when it comes to the application process to access Crown fibre. What they have indicated is that there's a fibre shortage, which is why our government is taking steps to work with the private woodlot owners of this province, who do own over 75% of the woodland in this province, to ensure that that our companies who need wood have greater access to those lands, so we can support that industry and move it forward in a way that is sustainable for this province and for future generations. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question again through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we know the Premier spent his weekend hobnobbing with Liberal senators and Liberal trust fund bag men and women, but he didn't have the time to meet with Joan Bork, who joined him at their convention. Mr. Speaker, she's a registered nurse. Ms. Bork has said in the media, and I quote, "There's days when we don't even get breaks. There's days when we can't even go to the bathroom, and when we do get a break, you worry about your fellow RN left in there with 6 sick patients." Mr. Speaker, healthcare workers work hard in their jobs and they deserve respect. My question through you to the Premier is, why does the Premier not believe that Ms. Bork deserves the respect to at least have had a conversation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, not only does Ms. Wark, all healthcare providers in this province, Mr. Speaker, deserve our respect. They do a tremendous job from one end of this province to the other. Mr. Speaker, they come to our rescue when in the most vulnerable time as human beings, Mr. Speaker. We as a government, Mr. Speaker, I know the Minister of Health has spent his time traveling, meeting with people, Mr. Speaker. I have people who have called my office looking for meetings. I've been more than prepared to arrange and make those meetings with any Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure which meeting the Minister, the Leader is referring to that didn't happen, Mr. Speaker, but I would encourage her to contact my office and we'll try to arrange a meeting.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll table these news articles from the Liberal Party convention. Perhaps that will refresh the Premier's memory of that incident. From media reports, Ms. Bork recalled the situation, and we understand she tried to have a conversation with the Premier at the convention to discuss her concerns, but the Premier wouldn't listen to her, nor would he even stop to talk to her. Another example that the Premier is putting Liberals first and not Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, it's clear now the Liberal government never intended to negotiate fairly with nurses at the table. So my question to the Premier is, since the Premier wouldn't even talk to Ms. Bork over the weekend, I will ask the question she was trying to ask, and that is, why won't the Premier respect the healthcare workers and their right to negotiate?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we do. Mr. Speaker, respect the right of healthcare workers to negotiate. Mr. Speaker, what we've put in place is a piece of legislation, essential service, that would ensure that Nova Scotia patients know what services are available to them, and then healthcare workers could go on strike, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the New Democratic Party when they were in power, who stripped the right to strike from paramedics, Mr. Speaker, who are healthcare workers.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know full well that when the Premier was on this side of the House, he was all for unionized healthcare workers, and he was all for their collective bargaining rights. And he said this over and over again, Mr. Speaker. He said it when the government of the day introduced legislation to take away the right to strike. And, you know, he said a lot of things about the support that he felt for workers and what he would do if he had an opportunity. Yet we see something quite different now, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question to the Premier is, could he please tell me where I would find in the Liberal Party's platform from the last election the commitment to bring in this particular piece of legislation?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what this piece of legislation is, Mr. Speaker, is a balance in ensuring that Nova Scotians have the essential service and healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, when they need it if a labour disruption is happening. And it also protects the right, Mr. Speaker, of healthcare workers to exercise their right to strike, Mr. Speaker. Unlike, Mr. Speaker, the former government that stripped paramedics of that right.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. There appears to be a plan, Mr. Speaker, to move nurses from other hospitals due to the potential of understaffed conditions in the Capital Health District. Patient safety should be the primary concern of government at this point. My question to the Minister, what assurances can the Minister give to the patients and staff working at the Aberdeen Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to assure the member representing Pictou that indeed patient safety and making sure that as many services that take place in that hospital from day to day and week to week remain in place. We already have a system that is very integrated. And this, in fact, is one of those, I guess, test periods when we'll see that it will work well and that Nova Scotians will get the emergency care, the acute care that they need tomorrow.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is quoted as saying, "I know that we may have to call on other health districts now to try and backfill those services." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This means that staff will be transferred to the Capital Region. The Pictou County Health Authority is responsible for delivering health care services to the 46,000 residents of Pictou County. My question to the Minister, which of those 46,000 residents will suffer most due to the staffing issues in the Capital Region?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, one of my discoveries on the provincial tour that I did was to discover at the Aberdeen and in the Pictou District Health Authority, a considerable number of very, very strong professionals that do extraordinary work every day. They have a collaborative care centre that, in fact, is a model for the province, and with that level of primary care and some specialty services, with the number of clinicians they have, I am sure the good residents of Pictou County will be well looked after in the coming days.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. The patients and staff across the province will feel the effects of the staff shortages in the capital region. The seriousness of these staffing levels will be felt for months due to the mismanagement of this government. My question to the Minister: how will this understaffing affect wait time for the surgeries planned at the Aberdeen Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, we know that we do have some current challenges for the next few days. But again, I have great faith in all who provide healthcare delivery in our province, that once this legislation is passed, and we will move forward to look after those who are in the queue for, especially for elective surgery, and get things back on track very quickly.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for you is to the Premier. In 2001, while debating the infamous Bill 68, the Liberal member from Richmond called back-to-work legislation draconian, and it's just downright scary. The Liberal health critic at the time told reporters there's a much bigger issue than just legislating the nurses back, and that is the fact that the government is coming down with such a heavy-handed, unilateral hammer against labour in the province. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier: why is he ignoring collective bargaining process and, to quote his colleagues, acting in such a draconian and heavy-handed way towards labour in the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for the question, Mr. Speaker. This piece of legislation that is before us, Mr. Speaker, is striking a balance, ensuring that the essential services Nova Scotians require in the healthcare system are there in case of a labour disruption, Mr. Speaker, as well as protecting the right to strike for healthcare workers as a negotiated collective agreement. Mr. Speaker, if you'd go back to 2001, he would know that that bill that was brought in actually took away the right to negotiate a collective bargaining. It was going to be settled by the Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, of that day. This is a very different bill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's also very different than the one that government brought in and the way they treated paramedics, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in 2007, the MLA for Annapolis, now the Premier, proudly said, and I quote, "In the last 25 years, there have been 3 hospital strikes in Nova Scotia. Our system has not been plagued with strikes or work stoppages. We all know that as a province we have worked hard and worked together for decades to keep workers' rights intact and therefore labour unrest at a minimum. Could the Premier explain why, after less than 6 months in office, he has now created chaos and unrest in the entire healthcare sector?"
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last 7 months, Mr. Speaker, there has been 3 potential labour disruptions in the healthcare system in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous government that took away the right to strike, Mr. Speaker, and forced paramedics back to work, Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, is a balance between ensuring that the essential services piece are in place and then healthcare workers can have the right to strike, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Also in 2007, the member from Annapolis, the Premier, said that the collective bargaining process is working in Nova Scotia. So my question is very simple, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Why does he no longer believe in the collective bargaining process?
The honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I very much believe in the collective bargaining process, Mr. Speaker, but Mr. Speaker, what we're having in place here is putting in place essential service so that Nova Scotians will know what services will be there in case of a labour disruption, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, the people feel that the workers feel that they need to take job action, Mr. Speaker, they can do so, Mr. Speaker. This piece of legislation is striking a balance, Mr. Speaker, unlike the piece of legislation that was brought in by the previous government to deal with paramedics.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, the Capital Health has said that staffing levels for the East Coast Forensic Hospital will be unsafe in the event of a labour disruption. This is a hospital that serves people directed there by the judicial system. My question for the Minister, how is the Minister ensuring the safety of patients and staff at the East Coast Forensic Hospital tonight?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very important question. As we know, patients at the East Coast Forensic Centre are patients, and we very much care about the safety of all Nova Scotians. It's indeed an important question, and my colleague, Minister of Health, is very much looking into that situation. Thank you very much.
Honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the safety of hospital staff and patients should be paramount. The ramping down of services at Capital Health should not impact people's health care, let alone their safety. My question then for the Minister of Health, has the Minister taken any steps to have heightened security at the East Coast Forensic Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member for Inverness. I recently spent some time at the East Coast Forensic Centre, and again, I know that the daily challenges they have in the institution there, and I know that at the present time they are dealing with a phase 3 level of urgency to make sure that they have coverage in the institution that will be adequate in the short term to make sure that the patients are indeed looked after properly.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I do know that Capital Health has said that proposed contingency staffing levels at the East Coast Forensic Hospital in Dartmouth are unsafe. Admissions cannot be declined. I will table that document. Mr. Speaker, the East Coast Forensic Hospital, unlike other facilities in the Capital Health District, is unable to turn away patients when they are admitted. This leaves staff even more vulnerable than if they were dealing with a controlled number of patients. My question, what does the Minister plan to do if staffing levels are not appropriate for the number of patients, and how will the Minister ensure that the proper care is delivered and that people remain safe?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I could say at the present time it's well past my normal bedtime, but I feel that essential service legislation is in fact of the greatest value to Nova Scotians, to those who need to enter the healthcare system, and those who are at places like the East Coast Forensic Centre. They would maintain the level of required staff when any type of disruption like a strike, which by the way can still go on in future days, to support healthcare workers across the province.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, surgical wait lists are growing in our province. Right now, the average wait time for knee replacement is 293 days. There are surgeries being cancelled as we speak due to the staffing shortages in the capital region. From October to December 2013, there was a 45% completed within a benchmark time frame. So my question to the Minister is, what is the Minister going to say to the patients who have waited nearly a year for a new knee, whose surgery is cancelled due to staff shortages?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. Yes, if a surgery is cancelled, such as some were today and some probably tomorrow, that is indeed, unfortunate. Indeed, and I know that when they've gone through a long wait time, in fact, to hear that it's cancelled at the last day or moment is pretty disturbing indeed. But I would ask the member to stay tuned to a budget this week that, in fact, will support a greater number of surgeries in the coming weeks with what will be delivered on Thursday.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that answer. As we know, we're looking at a labour disruption now that's going to cause a little bit more of just a delay, and hopefully that budget will make up the difference in this new with the people who are going to be late. But right now, the average wait time for a hip replacement is 206 days. There are surgeries being cancelled as we speak due to those staffing shortages as well in the capital region. And from October to December 2013, less than 60% were completed within the benchmark time frame. So my question again is, what is the Minister going to say to patients who have waited over 200 days for a new hip, whose surgery is being cancelled due to staffing delays and may be prolonged even further because of a labour disruption?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Speaker. To the member opposite, I know that at the present moment, those whose surgeries were cancelled today and probably tomorrow, they are in a delay pattern. But I know with the commitment in particular of the orthopedic surgeons in the province to a plan that we will unfold in the coming days, we will more than catch up and in fact start to move to address a wait list that in fact is one of the worst in the country.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount on his final supplementary.
I'm going down the list. Mr. Speaker, right now the average wait time for shoulder surgery is 172 days, again and growing. Their surgeries are being cancelled due to shortages and due to an impending labour disruption. This kind of surgery is essential for the patient to return to work, play with their children, or live an average quality of life. So again, my question is, what is the Minister going to say to these patients who have waited nearly 200 days for shoulder surgery and who may be cancelled due to staffing shortages and or labour disruptions?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, and the member opposite did use the right word. He said essential. And when essential service legislation is brought in, I think we can move through even a strike in a much more orderly and in a way that will make sure that Nova Scotians' health care is delivered on time and as full complement of services as can in fact be managed.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Healthcare workers want to be treated, Mr. Speaker, with respect and not have collective bargaining rights stripped from them. They were surprised to know that while nurses were at the bargaining table making progress towards a deal, that legislation affecting their rights would be introduced with little or no warning, Mr. Speaker. And this past weekend at their AGM, Liberals, including the Premier, seemed unaware that essential service legislation was on its way. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Labour is, was this legislation prepared prior to their AGM this weekend, and when did you advise your Premier this legislation was ready to go?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Our first priority is to protect the health and safety of Nova Scotians and to ensure our most vulnerable citizens are taken care of. We have introduced legislation that ensures patients and their families can continue to count on essential services during a strike. Government supports the principles of collective bargaining, but we also have a responsibility to look after our most vulnerable citizens and to ensure essential services are available during a strike.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, today at 5 p.m., while Capitol Health and its workers were at the bargaining table, someone leaked to the media that if an agreement was not reached by 7 p.m. Monday evening, the Liberals would introduce the essential service legislation. So my question to the Minister of Labour is, who leaked this information? And if you know, do you think it helps the collective bargaining process?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Government supports the principles of collective bargaining, but we also have a responsibility to look after our most vulnerable citizens. We all value the important work that nurses do, and I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotia is the only province in the country that does not have essential services legislation. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, healthcare workers would rather be concentrating on helping their patients than planning a trip to law amendments in the next few hours or so, Mr. Speaker, to speak out against this draconian bill. So I guess I want to ask the Minister of Labour, how much time does she plan on attending hours she wants to put in over at the law amendments to find out really what the problem is with healthcare workers in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. The legislation in question gives Nova Scotians peace of mind so that if a union does choose to go out on a strike, Nova Scotians will have a level of health care in the event of a strike. And, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that Nova Scotia is the only province left in Canada that does not, in fact, have this kind of legislation. So, to a previous member's question, I doubt that that healthcare workers coming from another province would be concerned about the fact that we have this legislation when every other province in the country does as well. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. The IWK Health Centre is not only an important part of the health system in Halifax, but acts as a service hub for all of Nova Scotia and the Atlantic region. This is an institution that provides essential health care for young patients from across our province and our region. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister is, what actions has his government taken in order to ensure that the services provided by the IWK Health Centre, an important and unique component of our healthcare system, are not interrupted?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. The work of the IWK will go on as normal, as usual tomorrow. The nurses at the IWK are part of the Nova Scotia Nurses Union, and they will be on the job 100% tomorrow, and our children from across Nova Scotia and from across Atlantic Canada will have their procedures and health requirements in full place tomorrow.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health was quoted in the Chronicle Herald on March 28 saying that the government may have to call on other health districts to try and backfill those services. And David, that piece of information. Procedures have already been cancelled and families are left in a state of uncertainty across the province. Patients throughout the province are worried about their children's care. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister, the essential services offered by the IWK are are allowed to be put in jeopardy. Well, what is this government going to do about this?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, tomorrow at the IWK, the work of the clinicians there will be going forward, and there will be no interruption of service for our children from the province and indeed from across Atlantic Canada.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg, on his final supplementary.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. The nurses that work at the IWK Centre, and many of whom are deeply concerned about the care that they provide to their patients and the children that go there on a regular and continuing basis, are concerned about where this whole business is going. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister answer why his government has let down the young patients of the IWK Health Centre and its nurses by failing to show real leadership during this time of important and crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again to the member opposite. The one reality that we do know about the IWK is that if there's high acuity and patient load on the floor tomorrow, members of the Nova Scotia Nurses Union have that flexibility in their latest contract to be able to call in a nurse, an LPN, or any other staff that in fact would deal with an extraordinary situation. So I think that is a great step forward. The first nurses union in Atlantic Canada to get that kind of language in their contract, which in fact reflects and responds to the dynamic nature of healthcare. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Last week, the Minister of Health suggested that there were more than enough nurses in our province. Our nurses' numbers are, to quote the Minister, well above the national average. However, we are hearing from nurses is that nursing positions are being left unfilled, and nurses who phone in sick are not being replaced. This causes a great deal of stress for those nurses who are left to pick up the slack, Mr. Speaker. So my question through you to the Premier, is it his view that we have enough nurses in Nova Scotia to ensure an adequate and safe healthcare system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the member and all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Health is working with all healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker, and ensuring that we have the appropriate number of staff looking after Nova Scotia patients, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know, and Nova Scotians know, that the last time the Liberals were in government, they actually paid nurses to leave, Mr. Speaker. Now the Premier is warning that nurses who take job action would be disciplined by their professional body, the College of Registered Nurses of Nova Scotia. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why would the Premier take such a hard line with the nurses of this province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation that we have before the House, Mr. Speaker, is striking a balance, Mr. Speaker. It's ensuring that we have the essential service piece in place so that Nova Scotians receive the health care when and where they need it, Mr. Speaker. And it's also respecting nurses' right, Mr. Speaker, to take job action when they feel necessary.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but with all due respect to the Premier, I wasn't asking about legislation. I was asking about comments that he made, really threatening comments towards nurses if they take job actions. So we all know, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know that in the 90s, after the cuts from the Liberal government to nurses, that we had a nursing shortage for many, many years. So my question is simple to the Premier. What is his plan to ensure that after this legislation is passed, we don't see more shortages of nurses here in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, our plan is to continue to respect, Mr. Speaker, the healthcare providers in this province. Mr. Speaker, we've struck a balance, we believe, with this piece of legislation that will allow, Mr. Speaker, for the essential service component to be in place, as well as making sure, Mr. Speaker, that nurses across this province who feel that they need to take job action still have the right to do so, Mr. Speaker, unlike, Mr. Speaker, the former government that took that right away from paramedics, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure and Renewal. Regulation for weighing the new Volvo Air suspension 49-foot spacing trucks have become an issue in Pictou County, Nova Scotia and across Canada. These new trucks allow for a significantly lower impact on fuel consumption, and the savings are approximately about $16,000 a year per truck. The problem is that these trucks, when going across weigh stations, are not weighed properly because of the distribution of weight. And my question is, I'm wondering if the Minister has brought this regulation up at Cabinet, and if so, when?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I truly thank the member for the question. There are a number of regulations with respect to vehicle compliance that we're looking at. In terms of how we move forward with some of the transportation issues, obviously, Mr. Speaker, there's an impact on the economy, there's an impact on our roadways. So anytime there are new measures and opportunities for us to use new technologies, use new equipment that makes the vehicles more fuel efficient and able to do their job better, we certainly look into that. So there is a process in place where we're using our vehicle compliance professionals to look at all options. We're open to anything. The member from Pictou, the other member from Pictou, brought a similar question to me about tires and the size of tires. We're going to look at all those options and certainly would welcome any suggestions, any ideas coming from the official opposition. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It definitely has had quite a huge impact on the economy, especially for Rolly McDonald, who's the owner of King Freight Line here in Pictou West. His situation is most difficult.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to orders of the day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading? Please call Bill number 37, the Essential Health and Community Services Act.
We'll now call Bill number 37 for second reading. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 37, an act to ensure the provision of essential health and community services, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, government values the critical work of those who care for people